The park that day looked like it had been painted by someone who wanted to prove that the world could still be kind. The sky was unusually clear, stretched wide and soft like a calm breath held for too long. The sunlight didn't feel harsh. It felt gentle, almost careful, as if it didn't want to disturb the peace of the trees or the laughter of children running across the grass. Everything felt normal on the surface, but there are days when normal hides something underneath it, something you only understand when it is already too late. I had taken my child there because it was supposed to be a simple outing. Nothing special. Just a break from routine, from walls, from the noise of daily responsibilities that never seemed to end. I remember thinking that fresh air would do us good, that a few hours in an open space would wash away the tiredness that had quietly built up over time. My child was happy at first, running slightly ahead, stopping to look at everything, asking small questions that children always ask when the world still feels new to them. I followed slowly behind, not rushing, just watching. There is a strange comfort in watching your child move freely, like the world still belongs to them and nothing has taken that away yet. That is when we saw it. At first, it looked like a normal ice cream stall in the distance. Bright colors, a small crowd, the usual attraction that parks often have. But the closer we walked, the more it started to feel different in a way I couldn't immediately explain. It wasn't loud like other vendors. It was strangely quiet, almost too controlled, as if even the sounds around it were being softened before they could reach it. And yet, it was beautiful. That's the part I still struggle with. It was not ugly or frightening. It was beautiful in a way that felt unnatural, like something designed to attract attention too perfectly. The stall had a faint glow to it, not like lights you plug in, but like the colors themselves were slightly alive. The menu board shifted softly between shades, and the ice creams inside the glass didn't look like ordinary ice cream. They looked smoother, brighter, almost unreal. My child stopped walking. That moment felt small, but it was. It was the beginning of everything. I noticed the way my child's attention locked onto one specific color, one specific flavor, as if everything else around had become irrelevant. I called gently at first, asking if we should keep walking, if we should maybe get something simpler somewhere else. But there was no response. Not because of disobedience, but because something deeper had already captured attention. We moved closer without fully deciding to. That is how these moments work. You think you are choosing, but something else is quietly guiding the steps. The air near the stall felt slightly different. Cooler. Not refreshing, but sharp in a way that made me aware of my own breathing. I told myself it was imagination. Parks are open places, temperatures shift, sunlight changes, and the mind exaggerates small things when it is unsure. The vendor stood behind the counter. I still cannot clearly describe them. Every time I try to remember their face, it becomes less certain, like my memory refuses to hold onto details it didn't fully trust in the first place. They were there, speaking softly, offering choices in a voice that didn't feel loud enough for the space around them. And yet, my child understood immediately. There was no hesitation. A finger pointed. A choice made. And before I could properly step in, the ice cream was already being handed over. That was the exact moment something inside me tightened, though I didn't yet know why. The ice cream looked perfect in my child's hands. Too perfect. Smooth surface, soft glow, colors layered in a way that seemed almost artistic. It didn't melt like normal ice cream should in warm air. It stayed firm for a few seconds longer than expected, as if resisting time itself. My child took the first bite. It was small, innocent, the kind of bite that should mean nothing more than joy. For a second, there was happiness. A small smile formed. And then it changed. Not suddenly like in movies, but slowly enough that it made me question whether I was imagining it. The smile didn't fade immediately, it froze. Like the expression forgot how to continue being natural. My child blinked once, then again, as if trying to understand what was happening inside their own mouth. I asked if everything was okay. No answer came. Only a pause. A strange, heavy pause that didn't belong in a simple park moment. Then the body reacted. A slight step backward, a hesitation in breathing, a confusion in the eyes that didn't match any normal discomfort I had ever seen before. The ice cream fell, but even then, it didn't behave normally. It didn't splatter or melt right away. It hit the ground and held its shape for a moment too long, as if the world itself was delaying the consequence of what had just happened. That was when fear finally became real. Not suspicion, not confusion. Fear. I knelt down immediately, calling the name I always used, trying to bring attention back, trying to pull my child out of whatever shift had just occurred. My hands touched small shoulders that suddenly felt too tense, too uncertain, as if the body was no longer fully in control of itself. The park noise continued around us, but it felt distant now. Like we had been separated from it without moving. People were still walking, still talking, still laughing somewhere far away, but none of it reached us anymore. Only the sound of uneven breathing stayed close. I don't remember deciding to lift my child. I only remember doing it. And then running. Not thinking. Not explaining. Just running through a world that suddenly felt too slow to match my urgency. That is where this story truly began. Not in the park, not at the stall, but in that moment when a mother realizes that something simple has turned into something she no longer understands. The moment I left the park running, everything behind me started to feel unreal, like I had stepped out of one world and into another that was moving too fast for my mind to follow. My child was in my arms, heavier than I remembered, not because of weight alone, but because of fear pressing into every step I took. The path ahead blurred slightly as my eyes kept shifting between the road and the small face resting against my shoulder. I kept speaking softly, even though I wasn't sure if my words were reaching anything anymore. I kept saying everything will be okay, even though I didn't yet know if that was true. The park gate felt too far away. I remember thinking it should not take this long to exit a place I had entered so easily just moments ago. But time was behaving strangely, stretching every second into something longer than it should be. The laughter from inside the park faded behind me, replaced by a strange silence that clung to my thoughts. When I finally reached the outer road, the world outside looked unchanged. Cars moved normally, people walked without urgency, and everything continued as if nothing had happened. That contrast made my panic feel even heavier. I wanted someone to notice, to understand that something was wrong, but life outside the park does not stop easily for unseen emergencies. I flagged down a vehicle. My voice was not steady. I don't even remember the exact words I used, only that urgency carries its own language when normal speech fails. The driver saw my face, or maybe it was my expression that made him stop without asking questions. The ride to the hospital felt too long and too short at the same time. My child was still in my arms, but the breathing had changed. It wasn't stable. It was uneven, uncertain, as if the body was struggling to decide what it should do next. I kept adjusting my hold, trying to make it easier, trying to reduce whatever discomfort was building silently inside. Every few seconds I would look down, hoping to see a sign that things were getting better. But instead I saw confusion deepening, like the body was reacting to something invisible and unstoppable. I remember pressing my forehead close, whispering again and again, trying to stay calm for the sake of the child, even though my own calm had already broken. The hospital appeared suddenly at the end of the road, large and overwhelming, like a place that had been waiting for us without knowing it. I rushed inside without understanding where to go first. The brightness inside was too sharp after the outside world. Everything echoed, footsteps, voices, distant alarms that made my heart tighten even more. I reached the reception and tried to speak, but my voice came out broken, incomplete, shaped by panic instead of clarity. People responded quickly after that. Too quickly for me to fully follow. One moment, I was holding my child tightly. The next moment, there were hands guiding, supporting, asking questions I could barely answer. I remember phrases like emergency, immediately, and bring the doctor, but they felt like they were happening around me rather than to me. Then came the separation. That moment stays with me more than anything else. A nurse gently but firmly took my child from my arms. It wasn't harsh, but it was final. My grip resisted instinctively, not because I didn't trust them, but because my body refused to accept distance at that moment. But my resistance lasted only a second before I realized I had no choice. And just like that, my child disappeared behind a set of doors. Those doors closed softly. But inside me, something closed much harder. I stood there in the middle of the corridor, suddenly empty-handed, suddenly still, as if the entire reason I was moving had been taken away and replaced with waiting. The hospital noise surrounded me, but I couldn't attach meaning to any of it. People walked past, charts were held, phones rang, machines beeped somewhere deeper inside the building, but all of it felt distant, like it belonged to another life. I tried to sit, but I couldn't stay still. I stood again, then paced slightly, then stopped, then stared at the doors that had taken my child. Every second felt like it was adding weight to my chest. My mind kept replaying the ice cream stall, as if understanding it now could somehow change what was already happening. The glowing colors, the unnatural stillness, the moment of that first bite, it all repeated without permission. I started questioning everything. Was it just food? Was it something wrong with the ice cream? Or something we couldn't see at all? But no answer came, only more silence from the other side of those doors. At one point, I placed my hand on the wall, feeling its cold surface. It grounded me for a moment, but not enough to calm what was rising inside. The hospital felt like a place that held both help and fear at the same time, and I was stuck between them, unable to move forward or backward. I don't know how long I stood there before I realized I was waiting for a sign, any sign, that my child was still fighting, still holding on. And that waiting became the new reality. The hospital corridor had stopped feeling like a place with an end. It had become a loop of silence and footsteps, repeating itself without permission, as if I had been placed inside a space where time forgot how to move forward. I kept staring at the closed doors. Every few seconds, I convinced myself they would open, and someone would step out with news that would immediately decide whether I could breathe normally again or not. But the doors stayed still, and that stillness slowly began to feel heavier than any movement could have been. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. I tried to hide it by folding them, then unfolding them, then pressing them against my knees, but nothing worked. The fear wasn't in my hands alone. It had spread through everything, my breathing, my thoughts, even the way I was hearing sounds around me. A nurse passed by and asked something softly. I think I nodded, but I don't remember the question. My mind was not processing language properly anymore. It was only holding on to one thing. My child was inside, and I was outside. That separation felt unnatural. At one point, I walked a few steps closer to the doors again, as if distance could somehow change reality. I stood there, trying to hear something, any sound that would confirm life was still stable inside. But the door was thick, and whatever was happening beyond it stayed hidden. The silence made my imagination louder. I started remembering the ice cream again, not as a full scene, but in fragments. The colors shifting slightly, the strange stillness around the stall, the moment my child's expression changed after the first bite. These images kept returning without my permission, each time slightly sharper, slightly more disturbing. I began asking myself questions I couldn't answer. Why did it feel so different? Why did it react so quickly? Was it something in the food, or something beyond it? But every question only led to another layer of confusion, and none of them gave me anything solid to hold on to. I sat down again, this time without realizing how long I had been standing. The chair felt cold, or maybe I just felt cold. My body was exhausted from running, but my mind refused to rest. It kept running in circles, replaying every second before the hospital, trying to find the exact moment where everything could have been prevented. That is how guilt begins. Not loudly. Quietly. In questions that have no answer. A doctor walked past quickly, and I noticed the urgency in their movement. It wasn't chaotic, but it wasn't calm either. Controlled urgency is the language of hospitals, and I was beginning to understand it without anyone explaining it to me. Each fast step made my heart react. Each closed door in the distance felt like it might be connected to my own situation. Then I saw a small movement near the entrance of the emergency section, more staff gathering, a brief exchange of words, a chart being passed from one hand to another. It was subtle, but in my state, everything became significant. I stood up again, this time faster. My body moved before my thoughts could decide whether it was a good idea. I took a step toward the area where the doors had swallowed my child. But before I could go far, a nurse gently redirected me back, speaking calmly but firmly, guiding me to stay in the waiting space. Waiting space. Even the name felt painful. As if I had been assigned to a place where I was only allowed to remain still, while everything important was happening elsewhere. I returned to the chair, but I no longer sat properly. I leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at the floor. The tiles had lines in them, repeating patterns that made it easier for my eyes to focus on something physical instead of the chaos inside my head. Still, my mind kept drifting back. To the park. To the ice cream. To the exact moment before the first bite, when everything still had the possibility of turning out differently. I tried to remember if there had been any warning, any sign I ignored, any instinct I dismissed, but memory is not always honest under stress. It starts reshaping itself, searching for blame, even where none is clear. A sound suddenly came from the corridor, doors opening somewhere deeper inside. My head lifted immediately. My body reacted before my hope even had time to form fully. But it wasn't for me. Someone else was being attended to. Still, that brief moment of movement inside the hospital felt like a signal from another world. A reminder that things were happening, decisions were being made, lives were being held together or pulled back from breaking. And my child was somewhere inside that system, fighting something I couldn't see. I pressed my hands together tightly again, not in prayer exactly, but in a desperate attempt to keep myself from falling apart completely. I realized then that waiting is not passive. It is active suffering with nowhere to go. Every second felt like it was adding weight. Every silence felt like it was hiding something. And I was still standing outside the truth, unable to reach it, unable to escape it, only able to wait for the moment when the doors would finally decide to tell me what was happening inside. The waiting did not become easier with time. It became heavier, like each passing minute was adding something invisible onto my shoulders until even sitting felt like effort. I stopped counting how long I had been there. At some point, numbers lose meaning in hospitals. You only understand moments, before and after, hope and fear, silence and movement. I remember noticing small things just to keep myself from breaking completely. The way the lights flickered slightly when someone opened a distant door. The way footsteps changed rhythm when someone was rushing versus when they were just walking. The way voices rose and fell behind closed curtains of rooms I could not enter. Everything had purpose inside that place, except me. I was only waiting. And then, without warning, the memory of the ice cream came back again, but this time differently. Not just the moment of the bite, but everything around it leading up to it. The park. The sunlight. The way everything had looked too perfect. I started noticing something I hadn't allowed myself to think about earlier. The stall hadn't just looked beautiful. It had looked carefully beautiful. Like every detail was designed to pull attention without effort. Even the way people seemed to move around it had felt slightly slower, as if the stall existed in a different rhythm from the rest of the world. I shook my head slightly, trying to push the thoughts away. Thinking too much in fear always creates shapes that may not be real. But my mind refused to stop now. It kept asking, why that stall? Why that ice cream? Why so immediate a reaction afterward? A nurse walked past and glanced at me briefly. I think she noticed I was not okay, but in a hospital, everyone is not okay in some way, so she continued on without stopping. That made me feel even more alone. At one point, I stood up again and moved closer to the reception area, asking if there was any update. My voice came out weaker than I expected. The person at the desk checked something quickly and told me to wait for the doctor. Always wait. That word was beginning to feel like a wall. I returned again to my seat, but I couldn't stay still. My foot kept tapping without control. My fingers kept pressing into my palm. My eyes kept shifting toward the same doors, hoping they would suddenly behave differently. Then something changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But enough that my body noticed before my mind fully understood. The corridor became slightly more active. A doctor passed quickly, then another. A trolley was moved further inside. A door opened and closed with more urgency than before. Even the air seemed to shift, like something important was happening deeper inside. My heart reacted immediately. I stood up so fast that the chair scraped behind me. This time, I didn't wait for permission to move closer. I stepped forward instinctively, but before I could reach the restricted area, a nurse gently stopped me again. Her hand was firm but not unkind. "Please wait here," she said again, softer this time, as if repeating it to someone who had already heard it too many times. But I wasn't hearing words anymore. I was reading movement. And movement was telling me something was happening. I sat down again, but my body was no longer cooperating fully. My breathing had become uneven, not because I was physically exhausted, but because uncertainty has its own kind of pressure. Inside my mind, everything was now divided into two worlds. The world outside those doors, where I was sitting, and the world inside those doors, where my child was. And the distance between them felt impossible to cross. I closed my eyes for a moment just to escape the sight of the corridor, but even with eyes closed, I saw everything more clearly. The park, the ice cream, the bite, the change, the rush to the hospital. And underneath it all, a growing fear that I still didn't fully understand. A sound finally broke through my thoughts. A door opening. My eyes snapped open instantly. Not just any door, one of the main ones deeper inside the emergency section. A doctor stepped out. And I knew immediately that this moment was different from all the earlier ones. Because this time, the doctor wasn't just passing through. They were coming toward me. The moment the doctor started walking toward me, the entire corridor seemed to narrow. It wasn't physical. It was something inside my perception, as if everything else in the hospital had blurred into the background and only that one approaching figure remained in focus. My heart reacted before my mind could even prepare for what was coming. I stood up immediately. This time I didn't hesitate, didn't look around, didn't try to steady myself. Instinct took over completely. The doctor's pace was controlled, not rushed, but in a hospital even controlled movement carries meaning. I noticed the chart in their hand again, slightly tilted this time, as if it had been held too many times in too many urgent situations. They stopped in front of me. That brief pause before speaking felt longer than anything I had experienced so far. My mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. I think I was trying to ask a question before they even spoke, but my voice refused to form anything. The doctor spoke gently first, asking me to sit. I didn't sit. I couldn't. My body had decided that sitting meant accepting something I was not ready to accept. So I just stood there, staring, waiting. Then the words came. Not all at once, carefully shaped, measured, like someone trying to deliver something heavy without letting it fall too harshly. They said my child was still under observation. That there had been a severe reaction to something ingested. That the body had responded in an unusual way, not like standard food allergy or common poisoning. Those words should have been comforting, still under observation, stabilizing, treatment ongoing. But my mind only caught the dangerous parts. Severe. Unusual. Reaction. I felt my legs weaken slightly, but I held myself upright. Then came the part that stayed with me the most. They said they were doing everything possible to identify what caused it. That sentence made my mind freeze again, because it confirmed something I had been trying not to fully accept, that they didn't fully understand what had happened yet. And if they didn't understand it, then neither did I. I asked a question, finally finding my voice, though it came out broken. Is my child going to be okay? There was a pause before the answer. Not a long pause, but long enough for fear to grow roots. The doctor didn't give a simple yes or no. Instead, they said the next few hours were critical. Critical. That word entered me deeply. Because it meant nothing was settled yet. Nothing was safe yet. Everything was still hanging in uncertainty. They told me my child was being closely monitored, that specialists were involved now, that every possible step was being taken. But all I could hear was the space between certainty. The unknown part. The part where anything could still happen. After that, the doctor stepped slightly back, as if giving me space to absorb it. But there was no space in my mind. Only noise, only thoughts colliding without order. I sat down without realizing I had moved. My body finally gave in before my mind did. The chair felt colder now, or maybe I had just become more aware of my own emptiness. I kept repeating the word, critical, in my head, not understanding how something so simple could feel so heavy. Around me, the hospital continued functioning normally. Phones rang, doors opened, footsteps moved with purpose. Life inside that building didn't stop for individual fear. But my world had narrowed down to one room inside that emergency section, where my child was still fighting something unseen. I looked at the doctor again, trying to find reassurance in their expression. But professionals are trained to stay composed. That's what makes them reliable, but also what makes them unreadable when you are desperate for emotional certainty. Before leaving, the doctor added one more thing. They said the condition was being managed, but they were still trying to understand the exact cause of the reaction. That detail stuck in my mind more than anything else. Still trying to understand. I kept thinking about it again and again. If they were still trying to understand it, then what exactly had we been exposed to? My thoughts drifted back unwillingly. The park. The stall. The ice cream that didn't behave like normal ice cream. I began to feel something strange growing inside me. Not just fear anymore, but doubt about what I had seen with my own eyes. Because nothing about that moment now felt simple. And simplicity was the one thing I desperately wanted. I leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at the floor again, trying to hold myself together while the hospital around me continued to breathe without stopping. Inside those walls, everything was being done to save my child. But outside those doors, I was learning something else. That sometimes, not understanding what is happening can be just as frightening as knowing something is wrong. After the doctor left, the corridor didn't return to normal. It never really does after news like that. It just pretends to. I stayed seated this time, but not because I felt calm. It was because my body had reached a point where movement and collapse felt equally difficult. My hands were still pressed together, not in prayer anymore, but in a kind of desperate restraint, as if holding them tightly could stop my thoughts from breaking apart. The word critical kept repeating itself inside me. Not loudly. Not like a scream. More like a quiet echo that refused to fade. Around me, life in the hospital continued in its structured chaos. A stretcher passed quickly down the corridor with someone lying still on it. A doctor gave instructions without looking up from a chart. A door opened and closed so many times it stopped feeling like an event. Everything had urgency, but also routine. That combination made it even more unsettling. Because it meant suffering was normal here. I tried to focus on something else, anything else. But my mind kept slipping back. Back to the park. Back to that stall that didn't feel like it belonged in the same world as everything else. Now that I had time to think without immediate panic, details started returning more sharply. The way the ice cream colors seemed too smooth, almost layered like something artificial. The way the air felt slightly colder near the stall, even though the rest of the park was warm. The way people nearby didn't seem to react to it in the same way my child did, as if attention itself had been selectively pulled. I shook my head again. I didn't want to go down that path of thinking. Because fear can build stories faster than truth can correct them. But another part of me couldn't ignore it anymore. What if it wasn't just a normal reaction? What if it was something unusual, something rare, something that didn't fit into the explanations they were currently searching for? That thought made my chest tighten again. I stood up and walked a few steps down the corridor without realizing it. I stopped near a window where the outside world could be seen faintly. The sky was darker now than it had been in the park. Time had moved on outside, even if I hadn't felt it properly inside. That realization hit strangely. Life outside continues no matter what happens inside you. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. My reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar. Tired eyes, still face, a kind of exhaustion that wasn't just physical. A nurse walked past and slowed slightly near me. "Any change?" I asked quickly before she even reached me. She shook her head gently. "Not yet." That simple answer carried more weight than I expected. Not yet meant everything was still unresolved, still unstable, still uncertain. I nodded, even though I didn't feel like I had accepted anything. Then I went back to the chair. Waiting again. Waiting had become my entire role in this place. At some point, I noticed small changes in the hospital rhythm. More movement near the emergency section, more coordinated urgency, less casual walking, more purpose-driven speed. Even without being told anything, my body understood that something inside had intensified. I sat forward immediately. My eyes fixed on the doors again. A few minutes later, a doctor passed quickly, followed by another carrying something I couldn't identify. There was a brief exchange between them, short and sharp, then they disappeared inside. My heart started beating faster again. Not because I had been told anything new, but because silence was no longer stable. Something was happening again, and I was still outside it. I stood up, but this time no one stopped me immediately because I hadn't moved toward the restricted area yet. I just stood there, watching. Then, from deeper inside, I heard a sound I couldn't fully interpret. Something like a machine adjusting, voices overlapping briefly, then returning to controlled order. It was small, but it changed everything inside me again. Because it meant my child wasn't just being observed. Something was actively being done. I pressed my hands to my chest without thinking, trying to slow my breathing. I told myself not to imagine worst possibilities. But the mind doesn't wait for permission. It imagines anyway. And in that moment, I realized something deeply unsettling. The hospital was fighting something inside my child. And I still didn't know what it was. The next stretch of waiting felt different. Not calmer. Not easier. Just changed. As if something inside the hospital had shifted its attention slightly, and even though I still had no answers, I could sense that decisions were being made deeper inside those walls, decisions that did not yet belong to me. I sat back down because my legs were starting to feel unreliable again. Not from exhaustion alone, but from the way hope and fear kept replacing each other too quickly to stabilize anything inside me. Every time I thought I had adjusted to the uncertainty, something would pull me back into sharper alertness. A door opening. A hurried step. A voice lowering mid-sentence. Small things. But in a place like this, small things are never just small. I noticed a nurse walk past holding a small tray with sealed containers. My eyes followed it instinctively. I didn't even know why it caught my attention, only that my mind was now hyper-aware of anything moving in or out of that emergency section. Time was still behaving strangely. Minutes felt stretched, then suddenly absent, like I was skipping through parts of reality without remembering them. At one point, I realized I had been staring at the same tile on the floor for too long. as if focusing on something simple could prevent my mind from collapsing into imagination again. But imagination was already there, and it was growing. I kept thinking about what the doctor said earlier, unusual reaction, still trying to understand the cause. Those words had not left me for even a second. Unusual meant it didn't fit expectations. Trying to understand meant they were still behind the problem, not ahead of it. And that gap, that space between cause and understanding, felt like the most dangerous place in the world to me right now. I stood up again, slowly this time, and walked closer to the corridor where movement was more frequent. I didn't cross any restricted line, but I needed to feel closer to what was happening. From there, I could see a bit more activity than before. A doctor speaking to another in a lower tone. A nurse adjusting something on a chart. A brief pause before someone entered a room quickly. Everything felt coordinated, but tense. Like an invisible thread was holding everything together, and everyone was carefully making sure it didn't snap. Then something happened. Not dramatic. Not loud. But enough that I felt it immediately. A doctor came out of the emergency section holding a file, not rushing, but not relaxed either. They spoke briefly to another staff member, then both looked toward a direction deeper inside. My heart responded before I understood anything. I stepped forward slightly. This time, no one stopped me immediately because I wasn't interfering. I was just watching. A nurse nearby noticed me and hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "Any update?" I asked quickly. She looked at me for a second too long. That pause mattered. Then she said, "There is some response to treatment." My breath caught slightly. Not a full answer. Not complete relief. But something had changed. Response meant the body was reacting. It meant they were not standing still anymore. I repeated it softly in my mind. Response. Response. I didn't even realize my eyes were filling slightly until I blinked. The nurse continued gently, saying they were still monitoring closely and that specialists were involved in identifying the substance or cause behind the reaction. Her voice was calm, trained, but I could sense the seriousness underneath it. Still no clarity, but not complete silence anymore either. That was the difference. I sat down again, but this time my posture changed. I wasn't collapsing inward as much. I was still tense, still afraid, but something had shifted from pure helplessness to unstable hope. And unstable hope is dangerous, because it keeps you awake. It keeps you thinking. It keeps you imagining outcomes that are not yet real. My mind immediately returned to the ice cream again, but now it didn't just replay the scene. It started analyzing it. The stall. The colors. The way it looked almost too perfect. I tried to remember if anyone else had reacted to it. I couldn't recall clearly. The park had been busy, but strangely, I couldn't remember anyone else interacting with that stall the way we did. That thought made my stomach tighten. I shook it away again. I didn't want to create stories out of fear. But then another thought came anyway. What if it wasn't just a simple contamination? What if it was something that didn't behave like normal food at all? My hands clenched again without permission. I forced myself to look away from those thoughts and back toward reality. The hospital, the corridor, the doors. A few more minutes passed. Then a sudden change in movement caught my attention. More urgency. More coordination. A doctor moving faster than before. Another nurse following immediately after. Something inside the emergency section seemed to escalate again. My body reacted instantly. I stood up so quickly, the chair shifted behind me. This time I didn't wait. I stayed where I was, but I was fully alert now, watching every movement with absolute focus. Then I saw it. A doctor speaking briefly to another, then turning toward the exit of the emergency section, as if heading somewhere specific. Not random movement. Directed movement. And in hospitals, directed movement usually means one thing: Information has been found. Or something has changed. My heart started beating harder again. I didn't move forward. I didn't speak. I just watched. Because I understood something in that moment. The waiting phase was not over. But it was no longer silent. And whatever was happening inside those doors was beginning to take shape into something that might finally reach me. The moment I realized the hospital rhythm had changed again, I stopped breathing properly for a second. It wasn't obvious to anyone else walking through the corridor, but I could feel it in the way the staff moved. The earlier uncertainty had been replaced by something sharper, decisions being executed faster, communication becoming more direct, footsteps more purposeful. I stayed standing near my chair, not sitting down this time, because my body no longer trusted stillness. Stillness made the fear louder. From where I stood, I could partially see the emergency section entrance again. Every time that door opened, my attention snapped to it instantly, like a reflex I couldn't control anymore. Then it happened. A doctor came out holding the same file I had seen earlier, but now it was accompanied by another sheet clipped on top, new information added. They didn't stop to look around. They moved directly toward a side station where another senior-looking staff member was already waiting. That small interaction changed everything in my perception. Because it didn't look like confusion anymore. It looked like direction. My heart began to tighten again, but this time it wasn't only fear. It was anticipation mixed with dread, a combination that makes even standing feel unstable. I took a few steps forward without realizing it, then stopped myself before crossing any boundary. A nurse noticed me but didn't intervene immediately. That itself told me something had shifted. I was no longer in the earlier phase of complete waiting. Something was developing. Inside my mind, I kept replaying the phrase, response to treatment. It had sounded hopeful earlier. Now it felt incomplete. Because response does not mean recovery. It only means interaction, and interaction can go in any direction. My thoughts drifted again, unwillingly, to the ice cream stall. This time, I tried to reconstruct it more clearly, like my mind was trying to solve a puzzle it had ignored before. The glowing colors. The strange stillness around it. The way my child had reacted immediately, almost as if drawn to it without hesitation. And then I noticed something new in my memory. Not the stall itself, but the lack of normal reactions around it. People passing by, but not engaging, not stopping, not behaving like they had seen anything unusual. That detail made my stomach tighten again. I pressed my fingers together hard, trying to push the thought away. I didn't want this moment to become about theories. I wanted it to stay about survival. A sudden movement in the corridor pulled me back. Two doctors now walking together, faster than before, speaking in low, serious tones. One of them gestured briefly toward the emergency section, then toward something written on the file. Then both nodded. That nod meant agreement. My body reacted instantly. I stepped forward again, this time unable to fully stop myself from inching closer. A nurse gently raised a hand, not blocking me, but reminding me where I was supposed to remain. I stopped. But my eyes stayed fixed. Something was happening. Something real. Not just monitoring anymore. Not just observation. Action. Then a new figure appeared, another doctor, older, more controlled in presence. The earlier doctors immediately adjusted their posture slightly when speaking to them. Hierarchy inside urgency. That detail mattered more than anything else. Because it meant this was no longer routine emergency handling. This had escalated. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. Then I heard fragments of words, just pieces carried through the corridor air. Unidentified reaction. Possible external source. Continue stabilization. My body went cold. Unidentified. External. Those words made my earlier fear sharpen into something more structured. This wasn't just a simple allergic reaction anymore. This was something they still couldn't fully classify. The older doctor took the file, looked at it for a few seconds, then gave a short instruction. Immediately, the staff moved again, more coordinated than before. And then, a nurse stepped out from the emergency section, holding something small in a sealed container. My eyes locked onto it instantly. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it mattered. Everything in the corridor seemed to slow down for me in that moment. My hearing dulled slightly, as if my entire focus had narrowed into a single point. I took one step forward, before stopping myself again. My hands were trembling now, not just from fear, but from the unbearable tension of not knowing what that object represented. Was it a sample? Was it something taken from my child's body? Was it something they had found? My mind refused to settle on any single answer. The nurse walked quickly past, disappearing into another room. And I was left again, with nothing but uncertainty. But something had changed permanently inside me now. Because I understood, even without being told directly. They were no longer just treating symptoms. They were trying to trace the cause. And whatever had come from that ice cream was now being actively investigated inside that hospital. I stood there, frozen between hope and fear, realizing that the next update would not just be an update. It would be a turning point. The corridor felt different after that moment, as if the hospital itself had tightened its grip on the situation. I no longer experienced waiting as empty time. Now it felt filled with invisible activity, decisions being made behind doors, results being checked, instructions being passed along unseen channels. Even when I wasn't seeing movement, I could sense it continuing. I stayed standing near the same place, unable to return fully to sitting. My body refused comfort now. Comfort felt inappropriate, almost dangerous, like letting my guard down while something unknown was still active inside my child's body. Every sound became meaningful. A distant beep. A door latch. A quick exchange of voices. All of it pulled my attention instantly, even when it had nothing to do with me. Then I saw the nurse again, the same one who had carried that sealed container earlier. She moved quickly, this time returning in the opposite direction, toward the emergency section. Her pace was faster than before, and she wasn't alone anymore. Another staff member followed closely behind her. My chest tightened. Something about repetition in hospitals is never random. When someone goes back and forth like that, it usually means results are being processed, or new instructions have been issued. I took a small step forward, without realizing it. Then stopped. I told myself to stay where I was, but my attention had already crossed the boundary. Inside the emergency section, activity seemed more concentrated now. Fewer scattered movements, more focused coordination. I could see brief glimpses through the partially open door, people standing closer together, heads slightly lowered, voices controlled. That kind of body language means one thing: focus under pressure. I pressed my fingers into my palm again, trying to ground myself. My mind, however, kept drifting back to what the doctor had said earlier. Unusual reaction. Still trying to understand. Possible external source. Those phrases had now become something heavier than fear. They had become questions that refused to settle. What exactly was external source? My thoughts immediately went back to the ice cream again, but this time I didn't just see it. I started breaking it down in memory, piece by piece. The texture, the color shift, the unnatural stillness around it. The way my child reacted so quickly, almost immediately after the first bite, as if the response had been triggered rather than gradually developed. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I shook my head slightly again. I didn't want to turn memory into suspicion. But it was no longer something I could control. A sudden movement interrupted my thoughts again. This time, two doctors exited the emergency section together and stopped near a side desk. One of them pointed at something on the file, then both leaned in slightly as if confirming details. Then one of them turned and walked directly toward another corridor leading deeper inside the hospital. Not outward. Deeper. That detail made my entire body react. Deeper usually meant lab, diagnostics, specialized testing, places where answers are built slowly from evidence. I instinctively took a step forward. A nurse noticed me and gave a small, calming gesture again, not stopping me but reminding me to remain patient. Patient. That word felt ironic now. Because patience was the only thing I had left, and it was being stretched thinner every minute. I returned my focus to the emergency doors again. And then, after a few more tense moments, something changed in the atmosphere. A doctor appeared at the doorway, but this time they didn't walk past or speak to staff immediately. They paused briefly, looked at the chart in their hands, then looked up. And for the first time, they seemed to be preparing to address someone outside the emergency area. My entire body went rigid. This was different. Not internal coordination. Not behind-the-scenes movement. This looked like communication. My breath became shallow. The doctor adjusted their position slightly and started walking toward the waiting area. Toward me. Not rushing. Not delayed. Intentional. I felt everything inside me tighten at once. Because I understood, even before they spoke a word. Whatever they were about to say would no longer be about uncertainty alone. It would be about direction. The doctor stopped in front of me again, and this time there was no illusion of casual waiting in their posture. Everything about them carried intention. I could see it in the way they held the file a little more firmly than before, in the way their eyes didn't immediately drift away after finding me, in the way the surrounding noise of the corridor seemed to fade slightly as my attention locked onto them completely. My body reacted before my thoughts could organize. I stepped closer. Not aggressive. Not desperate in movement. Just drawn forward by the weight of what was about to be said. The doctor didn't ask me to sit immediately this time. That itself made my stomach tighten. Instead, they took a breath first, as if choosing words carefully enough to avoid adding unnecessary fear. Then they began. They said there had been more clarity from the ongoing tests. That the medical team had identified signs of a strong external trigger, causing the reaction inside my child's body. Those words hit me differently now. External trigger. Not internal condition. Not random allergy. Something introduced from outside. My mind immediately snapped back to the ice cream again, sharper than ever before. This time it wasn't just memory. It felt like connection forming, whether I wanted it or not. The doctor continued. They explained that the reaction was severe but partially responding to treatment, and that the body was stabilizing in stages. Not fully stable yet, but no longer in the most critical downward phase. I heard the words, but my mind clung to one thing only. Responding. Not worsening. Not lost. Responding. My knees weakened slightly, and this time I actually sat down without resistance. My body finally accepted support because it had reached its limit of standing in tension. The doctor stayed in front of me, continuing in a calm but serious tone. They mentioned that samples were still being analyzed, that specialists were working to understand the exact composition of whatever caused the reaction. But even as they spoke, my mind was no longer fully inside that explanation. It had already gone somewhere else. Back to the park. Back to the stall that didn't feel normal in hindsight. I started remembering more details now. Things my fear had initially blurred. The way the vendors' movements felt slightly too smooth. The way the stall didn't seem affected by surrounding activity. The way, for a brief second, I had felt hesitation, but dismissed it because everything looked too beautiful to be wrong. That realization hurt more than fear. Because fear is immediate. Regret builds slowly. The doctor's voice brought me back again when they said the hospital would continue monitoring closely and adjust treatment based on findings. They also mentioned that once stability improved further, they might try to identify the source more precisely with external analysis. External analysis. Everything was pointing outward now. Something outside had entered inside. After a moment, the doctor asked me if I had noticed anything unusual before the incident. The question hit me harder than I expected. Because it wasn't just medical. It was personal. I opened my mouth slightly, but nothing came out at first. Then slowly, I began to speak. I told them about the park, about the ice cream stall, about the way it looked too perfect, about the color, the stillness, the immediate reaction after the first bite. As I spoke, I realized my voice was shaking, not just from fear, but from the weight of finally giving those memories form outside my mind. The doctor listened without interrupting, writing a few notes. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable, but heavy. Then they nodded slightly and said they would include this information in the investigation. Investigation. That word stayed with me, because it meant this was no longer just treatment. It was now something being traced backward. Cause, not only effect. The doctor stepped back slightly, then added that my child was still under close observation, but the response to treatment was now more stable than before. Not fully safe, but improving. Improving. That word felt like air returning slowly after drowning. I stayed seated, trying to absorb everything at once, but my mind couldn't settle. It kept circling back to one idea. If it was something external, then it wasn't random. And if it wasn't random, then it had a source. And that source was still unknown. The doctor finally left, and the corridor returned to its slow rhythm again. But I was no longer in the same state I had been before this conversation. Something had shifted inside me. Fear was still there, but now it was joined by something else. The beginning of understanding that whatever happened in that park was not just an accident. And somewhere behind those hospital doors, my child was still fighting to come back fully from it. After the doctor left, I remained seated, but I was no longer the same person who had been waiting earlier. Something inside me had changed, not in relief, not in peace, but in direction. Before, I was only surviving the uncertainty. Now, I was trying to understand it. The corridor still moved around me, still breathed with hospital life, but I felt slightly separated from it, like my mind had stepped one layer deeper into thought while my body stayed behind. The words kept repeating. External trigger. Unusual reaction. Improving response. Each phrase now connected like pieces of a line that had started forming a shape. I kept thinking about the park again, but this time I didn't just replay it. I examined it. The stall. The ice cream. The way it seemed too perfect, too controlled, too visually consistent with itself, as if nothing around it affected it. I tried to remember if I had seen anything like it before in the park, or if it blended in like it belonged there naturally. But my memory kept returning to the same feeling. It didn't belong, yet it appeared like it did. That contradiction bothered me more than anything. Because danger usually looks like danger in hindsight. But this had looked like beauty. A nurse walked past and slowed slightly, noticing I was still sitting in the same position. She didn't ask anything this time, just checked the direction of the emergency section and continued on. Time passed again. Not clearly. Not in measurable way. Just movement of light, footsteps, distant activity. Then a change. Subtle at first. Then undeniable. The frequency of movement increased again near the emergency section. Not chaotic, but coordinated urgency returning. Doctors began gathering briefly in one area, then dispersing again with renewed purpose. My body recognized it immediately. Something new had come in. I stood up slowly this time, not rushing, just watching carefully. A staff member moved past holding updated files again, this time thicker, as if more data had been added. Another followed, speaking quickly but quietly. I couldn't hear full sentences, only fragments. Results confirm. Continue protocol. Monitoring response. My breathing tightened slightly. Results confirm. That phrase meant something had been identified, at least partially. I took a small step forward, then stopped again. I didn't want to overwhelm anyone inside the system, but I also couldn't stay completely still anymore. I needed to know what was changing. Inside the emergency section, I saw a brief opening in movement. A doctor standing still for a moment, reading something on a screen or chart more carefully than before. Then a nod. A clear nod. Not uncertain. Not questioning. Decisive. That single gesture changed the atmosphere again. Because now it wasn't only investigation. It was confirmation of something. My hands instinctively pressed together again, tighter this time. I felt my chest tighten with mixed fear and fragile hope. Then I saw the doctor who had spoken to me earlier reappear at the edge of the corridor. They looked different now. Not calmer, but more resolved. As if part of the uncertainty had been reduced. They started walking toward me again. My body reacted instantly. This time, I didn't even realize I had stepped forward until I was already halfway standing. They stopped in front of me. No hesitation. No long pause. And then they spoke. They said the condition was now more stable than before. That the body's reaction had been brought under better control. That the critical phase was no longer escalating. Those words entered me like air after suffocation. But they didn't stop there. They added that analysis had narrowed down the possible source of the reaction significantly, based on the information provided and ongoing tests. Narrowed down. Not fully identified. But focused. My mind immediately latched onto that. Focused meant progress. Progress meant direction. The doctor continued, explaining that while full confirmation was still in process, they were now much closer to understanding what type of external factor had triggered the reaction. I heard the words, but I was already overwhelmed by the shift. From unknown danger to narrowing understanding. My legs felt weak again, but this time it was not collapse, it was reaction. The doctor reminded me that my child was still under observation, but now there was cautious optimism in their tone. Cautious. Optimism. Two words that did not belong together easily, but somehow existed side by side in that moment. After speaking, the doctor didn't leave immediately. They stayed for a second longer, as if checking whether I had understood everything. I nodded slowly, not fully able to speak. Then they turned and walked back toward the emergency section. And I remained standing. Not in panic now. Not in pure fear. But in something more complicated. A fragile space between hope and uncertainty, where I could finally see that this was not just a moment of danger anymore. It was becoming a path toward explanation. And somewhere inside those hospital doors, my child was slowly being pulled back from whatever had entered their body in that park. The final hours did not arrive with drama. They arrived with gradual change. That was the strange part about survival situations. You expect a single moment where everything shifts, but instead you get slow confirmation, piece by piece, until your fear doesn't know when to fully end. I was still in the same chair, but I was no longer gripping it like before. My body had loosened slightly, not because everything was solved, but because the hospital's energy had changed again. Less urgency. More control. More stability. The corridor no longer felt like it was on the edge of collapse. It felt like it was managing something that had already passed its most dangerous point. Still not safe, but no longer falling. That difference mattered more than anything else. I kept watching the emergency section doors, but now without the same desperation. My eyes still followed every movement, but my breathing had started to settle into something closer to normal. Then, after what felt like a long stretch of quieter time, a nurse approached me. This time, her steps were not rushed. That alone made my heart respond differently. She stopped near me and spoke softly, telling me I could see my child soon. Those words took a moment to reach my mind properly. Could see. Not critical update. Not urgent situation. See. My body reacted before I could think. I stood up quickly, then had to steady myself because my legs weren't used to hope yet. The nurse guided me gently, and for the first time, I was not being held back from the emergency section. I was being led toward it. Each step felt unreal. The same doors that had once separated me from fear were now opening for me. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter than I expected. Machines still existed, monitoring still continued, but the tension had shifted. It felt like a room after a storm has passed, still serious, still recovering, but no longer breaking. And then I saw my child. Lying still, connected to monitoring equipment, but no longer in the same visible distress I had seen earlier. The breathing was steadier, the face calmer, not fully awake, but no longer trapped in that earlier unstable state. I stopped walking for a second. My entire body froze, not from fear this time, but from overwhelming relief that didn't know how to express itself properly. I moved closer slowly, as if sudden movement might break the moment. My hand reached out carefully, touching gently. And I realized something I had been holding inside me since the park. I had been bracing for loss without knowing it. But it wasn't loss. It was recovery. A doctor nearby spoke quietly, explaining that the treatment had stabilized the reaction significantly, and the body was now responding in a controlled and improving way. They said continued observation would still be necessary, but the most dangerous phase had passed. Passed? That word felt different from everything else. Not partial. Not uncertain. Passed. I stayed there, sitting beside my child, not speaking much, just watching the steady rise and fall of breathing that now felt like the most precious rhythm in the world. And as I sat there, my mind briefly returned one last time to the park. The ice cream stall. The strange beauty. The moment, everything changed from ordinary to unknown. But now, that memory no longer felt like a permanent ending. It felt like the beginning of something that had been confronted, understood, and survived. Outside that hospital room, life continued as always. But inside it, I finally understood what had been taken from me and returned again. Not just my child's safety, but the fragile realization that even in the most frightening unknown moments, there is still a path back, if help arrives in time. The story did not truly end the moment I left the hospital room. It ended in a quieter way, the kind of ending that doesn't feel like a full stop, but more like life slowly returning after something has shaken it deeply. I stayed beside my child even after the doctors said the most dangerous phase had passed. Relief doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers. First, there is disbelief, then silence, then a strange emptiness where fear used to live. I remember watching the steady rhythm on the monitor for a long time, as if my eyes needed proof that it would not suddenly change again. Every beat felt like a promise, not of perfection, but of survival. The hospital no longer felt like a place of panic. It felt like a place of recovery. People still moved quickly, still spoke in serious tones, but now there was something softer underneath it all, controlled stability instead of controlled urgency. At one point, the child moved slightly. That small movement broke something inside me in the best possible way. My hand immediately reached closer, not out of fear anymore, but out of instinct to protect what had almost been lost. The eyes did not fully open yet, but the breathing shifted slightly, as if the body was slowly returning from somewhere distant. The doctor later explained again, in simpler terms, that the reaction had been severe but successfully brought under control. They still could not identify everything with absolute certainty, but they were confident that whatever had triggered it was no longer affecting the system. Those words should have felt technical. But to me, they felt like survival translated into language. When I finally stepped outside the hospital hours later, the air felt different. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. The same road that once carried panic now carried silence. The same sky that once felt distant now felt real again. I looked toward the direction of the park, without realizing it. And for a moment, my mind returned one last time to that strange stall. The beautiful ice cream that didn't feel ordinary. The moment that had started everything. But this time, fear didn't rise the same way. Instead, there was only understanding mixed with caution. Some things in life appear harmless because they are designed to appear harmless. And sometimes survival is not about recognizing danger instantly. It is about reacting in time when something feels even slightly wrong. I walked away from the hospital with my child safely in my arms, feeling something I had almost forgotten during those hours of waiting. Not happiness exactly. Not peace completely. But gratitude that had survived fear. And in that silence, I finally understood the real ending of that day. We did not lose everything to that beautiful, strange moment in the park. We came back from it, changed, shaken, but still together. Leaving the hospital, I could barely walk straight for a while. It felt as if the ground was still shaking under some unknown tension, even though everything around me looked completely normal. But inside me, that park still hadn't left. The glow of that ice cream, that 1 second of false comfort. My child was still weak, but alive, and the word alive had become more important to me than any happiness I had ever known. I kept looking at that face again and again, now resting in sleep. And every time the same thought hit me, if we had been even a little late, if I had hesitated in that moment, maybe this face would not have been here with me now. Outside the hospital, the sunlight was normal, people were normal, life was moving normally. But for me, everything had changed. I was no longer the same person who had gone to the park that morning. Now I looked at everything with suspicion. Every shiny thing, every perfect thing, every too beautiful to be real thing. The journey home was silent. There was not much to say, only a strange feeling that we had survived, but something inside us had been lost forever. That innocence, which once trusted things without question, would never fully return. When we reached home, I laid my child on the bed and just sat there watching. At times it still felt like I was dreaming. But then the hospital smell, the doctor's voices, and those emergency doors came back into my memory again, and I knew it was real. The night was very long. That night, I thought about that ice cream stall in the park one last time. And this time, along with fear, I felt something else too. A question. Was that ice cream stall real? Or just an experience sent our way so that in one moment, we could learn something that would stay with us for life? I never got the answer. But I did gain one thing. Now I trust my instinct more than my eyes. And whenever something feels too perfect, too beautiful, or too magical, I stop. Because on that day, I learned something important. Sometimes survival is not only about hospitals saving you. Sometimes even a small hesitation can save a life. And that ice cream, it was not just a moment that ended. It became a memory that will always remind me. Not everything that shines is safe, but after going through fear, a person learns how to truly live again.